Your heart stops, your lungs stop, your blood stops flowing. By every medical definition, you are dead. But your brain doesn't stop, not immediately. For minutes after your heart stops, your brain continues to fire. Neurons still communicate, electrical activity still pulses. And in those final minutes, something extraordinary happens. Something that has changed how scientists understand death itself. I spent 6 months researching what actually happens to the human brain after death. I read the studies. I interviewed researchers who have recorded brain activity in dying patients. What I found challenged everything I thought I knew about the line between life and death. And by the end of this video, you might never see death the same way again. But first, let me ask you something. What do you think happens when you die? Most people think it's like turning off a switch. One moment you're here, the next moment you're gone. The brain just stops. That's not what the science says. Here's what's actually happening inside your brain after your heart stops. Your brain consumes 20% of your body's oxygen. It has no oxygen reserves. When your heart stops, oxygen delivery stops immediately. Your brain cells begin to die within minutes, but not all at once, not in a wave. The process is slower than you think, and stranger than you think. Within 10 to 20 seconds of your heart stopping, you lose consciousness. You are not aware. You cannot respond. But your brain is still active. In fact, for a brief period, your brain becomes more active than it was before death. A study from the University of Michigan found that in rats, brain activity surged in the 30 seconds after cardiac arrest. The activity was synchronized, coherent, organized. The researchers recorded gamma waves, the same brain waves associated with conscious awareness and memory retrieval. The dying brain was not shutting down. It was lighting up. The lead researcher described it as a state of heightened conscious processing. The brain was more active after death than before. Now let me tell you about the human studies. In 2013, researchers at the University of Cincinnati studied brain activity in 7 terminally ill patients who were removed from life support. As their hearts stopped, their brains showed a surge of electrical activity. The activity was similar to what is seen in people who are awake and conscious. One patient showed persistent brain activity for over 10 minutes after the heart stopped. 10 minutes. That's not a few seconds. That's an eternity when you're talking about brain activity after death. Here's what the research says about near-death experiences. Approximately 10 to 20% of people who survive cardiac arrest report memories from the time they were clinically dead. They report floating above their bodies, moving through a tunnel, seeing a bright light, meeting deceased relatives, reviewing their entire life in seconds. For decades, scientists dismissed these reports as hallucinations, the brain shutting down, random firing of dying neurons. The evidence now suggests something else. A study published in the journal Resuscitation collected accounts from 2,060 cardiac arrest survivors across 15 hospitals. Of those, 330 reported some awareness during the time they were clinically dead. 40% of those reported a perception of observing their own body from above. They could describe details of the resuscitation that were later verified. One patient described watching his own resuscitation from the corner of the room. He accurately described the equipment used, the positions of the staff, and the sounds of the machines. His description was verified by the medical team. He had been clinically dead when these events occurred. Now let me tell you about the largest study of near-death experiences ever conducted. The AWARE study, led by Dr. Sam Parnia at the University of Southampton, followed 2,060 cardiac arrest patients across 15 hospitals in the United States, the United Kingdom, and Austria. The study placed images on shelves in resuscitation rooms. The images were visible only from above. They could not be seen from the patient's position on the bed. The goal was to see if patients who reported out-of-body experiences could describe the images. One patient did. A 57-year-old man who was clinically dead for 3 minutes described floating above his body and watching his resuscitation. He accurately described the images placed on the shelves. Images he could not have seen from his body. The study concluded that consciousness may continue for some time after the brain has stopped functioning, not as a ghost, not as a soul, as something we don't yet understand, something that challenges the assumption that consciousness is purely a product of brain activity. Here's what the research says about the timing of brain death. When your heart stops, your brain cells don't die immediately. They enter a state of hypoxia, low oxygen. They can survive for minutes. Some cells can survive for hours. The process is not instant. A study from Yale University shocked the scientific community in 2019. Researchers at Yale restored circulation to pig brains that had been dead for 4 hours. The brains showed restored cellular function. Neurons fired. Blood vessels responded to drugs. Synaptic activity resumed. The brains were not conscious. The researchers were not trying to create consciousness. But the cellular machinery of the brain, the parts that generate consciousness, were still functional. Hours after death. The study raises profound questions. If a pig brain can be restored 4 hours after death, how long could a human brain survive? What is the actual time limit? And what happens in those final minutes before the cells are beyond repair? Now let me tell you about the phenomenon of terminal lucidity. This is when patients with advanced dementia, Alzheimer's, or other degenerative brain conditions suddenly become lucid shortly before death. They recognize family members. They speak clearly. They remember details they haven't recalled in years. Hours before they die, terminal lucidity has been documented for centuries. It occurs in patients whose brains are severely damaged, whose neurons are dying, whose brain tissue is atrophied, and yet, moments before death, they are more present than they have been in years. The phenomenon challenges the assumption that consciousness is purely a product of the physical brain. How can a dying brain, a brain that has lost significant tissue, suddenly produce clear consciousness? That's not how brain damage works. Brain damage doesn't get better hours before death. A study from the University of Edinburgh reviewed 100 cases of terminal lucidity. The patients had advanced dementia. Their brains showed significant atrophy, and yet within 24 hours of death, they became lucid. They recognized family. They had conversations. They seemed to know they were dying. The mechanism is unknown. Some researchers suggest it's a surge of neurotransmitters. Others suggest it's the brain's final attempt to organize itself, but no one knows. And the phenomenon is so consistent that hospice workers have learned to recognize it as a sign that death is approaching. Now let me tell you about the connection between death and the default mode network. The default mode network is the brain system that activates when you're not focused on external tasks. It's responsible for self-referential thought, autobiographical memory, and the sense of self. A study from the University of Liege in Belgium found that the default mode network remains active in some patients after cardiac arrest. The network continued to fire. The brain continued to process. The self was still there. Here's what the research says about the timing of self-awareness after death. The default mode network is one of the last networks to shut down. It persists for minutes after the heart stops. Your sense of self, the thing that makes you you, is the last thing to go. Now let me tell you about the connection between death and memory retrieval. The life review phenomenon, where people report seeing their entire life flash before their eyes, is one of the most common near-death experience reports. A study from the University of Edinburgh found that the brain's memory systems are highly active during cardiac arrest. The hippocampus, the memory center, shows a surge of activity. The amygdala, the emotional center, also activates. Your brain is replaying your life, not randomly, in an organized way. Researchers have documented gamma wave activity in the dying brain. Gamma waves are associated with conscious awareness, attention, and memory retrieval. The dying brain is not randomly firing. It's processing, it's retrieving, it's reviewing. A study from the University of Michigan found that the dying brain shows a surge in gamma wave activity that is more organized than during normal waking consciousness. The activity was synchronized across multiple brain regions. The brain was more coherent in death than in life. Now let me tell you about the ethical implications of this research. If the brain remains active for minutes after death, if it can process information, retrieve memories, and generate conscious awareness, what does that mean for organ donation, for end-of-life care, for how we define death itself? Currently, death is defined as the irreversible cessation of circulatory and respiratory function, or the irreversible cessation of all brain function. But if the brain continues to function for minutes after the heart stops, the first definition is inaccurate. And if the brain can be restored after hours, as the Yale study suggests, The second definition may be too strict. The research is challenging the very definition of death, not as philosophy, as medicine, as law, as ethics. Here's what the research says about the timing of organ donation. Donated organs are typically harvested after the heart stops. If the brain remains active for minutes after cardiac arrest, is the patient truly dead? Could they be aware? Could they feel pain? A study from the University of Virginia found that patients who are declared dead by circulatory criteria may have brain activity for up to 10 minutes after their heart stops. 10 minutes. That's longer than the typical time to organ harvest. The study has led to calls for revised protocols, for waiting longer before declaring death, for ensuring that patients are truly brain dead before organs are harvested. Now let me tell you about the connection between near-death experiences and brain chemistry. Some researchers have tried to explain near-death experiences as hallucinations caused by lack of oxygen, release of endorphins, or activation of the temporal lobe, but there's a problem. The brain chemistry of dying is not the same as the brain chemistry of hallucinating. Oxygen deprivation typically causes confusion, disorientation, and fragmented thinking, not organized life reviews, not accurate out-of-body observations. A study from the University of Maribor in Slovenia compared near-death experiences to drug-induced hallucinations. The two were not the same. Drug-induced hallucinations were chaotic, unpredictable, personal. Near-death experiences were structured, consistent across cultures. The tunnel, the light, the life review. The out-of-body observation, the consistency suggests that near-death experiences are not random hallucinations. They are a specific biological response to dying, one that the human brain is programmed to produce. Now let me tell you about the connection between death and the brain's final electrical wave. Researchers have documented a phenomenon called spreading depolarization in the dying brain, a wave of electrical activity that spreads across the cortex. The wave is slow, measurable, predictable. A study from the University of Cincinnati found that spreading depolarization occurs in the dying human brain. The wave marks the transition from life to death. It is the final organized electrical activity before the brain goes silent. But here's what's interesting. The wave can sometimes be reversed. In animal studies, researchers have been able to restore brain activity after spreading depolarization. The brain is not gone, not irreversibly. There is a window. Here's what the research says about the window for resuscitation. The window is longer than previously thought. Minutes, not seconds. Minutes. The brain can survive longer than we thought, and the lines between life and death are blurrier than we thought. Now let me tell you about the 5 most common misconceptions about brain death. Misconception number 1. Death is a moment. It's not. It's a process. The heart stops. The brain continues. Cells die over minutes and hours. Death is not a switch, it's a threshold. Misconception number 2. The dying brain is shutting down randomly. It's not. It's highly organized. The surge in gamma waves, the activation of the default mode network, the organized life review. The dying brain is processing, not decaying. Misconception number 3. Near-death experiences are hallucinations. The evidence suggests otherwise. The reports are too consistent. The verifiable observations are too accurate. The brain chemistry of dying is not the same as the brain chemistry of hallucinating. Misconception number 4. Brain activity after death is irrelevant. It's not. It changes how we define death, how we practice organ donation, how we care for dying patients, how we understand consciousness itself. Misconception number 5. We know what happens when we die. We don't. The research is in its infancy. The first human studies of brain activity after death were published in the last decade. We are just beginning to understand. Here's what the research says about the future of death science. New technologies are allowing researchers to study the dying brain with unprecedented precision. Portable EEG devices, functional MRI, near-infrared spectroscopy. Researchers can now measure brain activity in dying patients in real time. The next decade will likely produce discoveries that challenge everything we think we know about death, about consciousness, about the line between life and death. A new study is currently underway. The AWARE-2 study is an expanded version of the original AWARE study. Researchers are placing images on shelves, but also measuring brain activity with portable EEG devices. They are trying to verify out-of-body experiences while simultaneously recording the brain activity that accompanies them. The results have not yet been published, but early reports suggest that the findings are consistent with the original study. Some patients report out-of-body experiences. Some brain activity continues after cardiac arrest. The mystery remains unsolved. Here's what I want you to take away from this video. Your brain does not stop when your heart stops. It continues for minutes, sometimes longer. It processes, it retrieves, it reviews. Your brain, in its final moments, may show more organized activity than it did in life. More coherent, more synchronized, more aware. We don't know why. We don't know what consciousness is. We don't know if the experiences of dying patients are real or illusory. But we know something is happening, something we don't yet understand. The line between life and death is not a line, it's a blur. And the dying brain is not silent, it is speaking. We just haven't learned how to listen. Let me quickly recap the 5 most important things you need to remember. Number 1. Brain activity continues for minutes after the heart stops. Sometimes up to 10 minutes. The dying brain does not shut down immediately. Number 2. The dying brain shows a surge in gamma wave activity, more organized than during waking consciousness. The brain is more coherent in death than in life. Number 3. Near-death experiences are not random hallucinations. They are structured, consistent across cultures, and sometimes verifiable. Patients can describe events that occurred while they were clinically dead. Number 4. The window for brain resuscitation may be longer than we thought. Yale researchers restored cellular function to pig brains 4 hours after death. The brain can survive longer than we believed. Number 5. We are just beginning to understand what happens when we die. The first human studies were published in the last decade. The next decade will bring discoveries that challenge everything we think we know. If this video changed how you see death, hit like so. Winds of Thought can bring you more science of the brain and consciousness. And comment below. What do you think happens after death? Share your thoughts. Someone in the comments might need to hear this conversation. Send this video to someone who needs to hear it. Your friend who's afraid of death. Your family member who's lost someone. Your colleague who wonders what happens next. This science might change how they see the end. Your brain has been waiting to be understood. Even at the end, even after the heart stops, the brain speaks. We're just beginning to listen. Start the conversation today.